Hi, and thanks for joining me today for this look into the Great Rose Window at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. My name is Michelson-Bartlett. I am the manager of visitor services at the Cathedral, and I will be talking with you today a little bit about the iconography and imagery of the Rose Window, as well as how it became such an important part of the cathedral itself. Before we get started, I just want to turn your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, where you will see the logo of the cathedral, which, yes, does include the outline of the rose window. It is probably our most iconic element, and it is something that we frequently use to represent the larger institution as a whole, just like we do with the logo. So to go ahead and get started, we'll begin by looking at the rose window from the exterior of the building, out on Amsterdam Avenue. And you can see from this image, it is a central element of the architecture. It was installed in the front wall in 1932. Its construction was paid for by William Woodward, who was the president of Hanover Bank, and he gave it in honor of his parents, William and Sarah Woodward, and his uncle, James T. Woodward, also very prominent figures in New York social scenes. On a side note, we won't go into it because it doesn't directly relate to the rose window, but the Woodward family had some very fun drama later on in the 20th century. If you look them up, all of the sons were later named William, and there's some great stories. But to focus on our rose window, the Woodward family gave them money, and the window itself was constructed by Charles J. Connick, who was a glass artist out of Boston. And if there's one thing that you should know about Charles Connick, it's that he took his craft very seriously. And he felt strongly that stained glass within the context of architecture should complement and enhance the features of the building around it. So not surprisingly, he was very popular with certain architects, including the guy who designed the main aisle of the cathedral, Ralph Adams Cram. Another side note, they were also both from Boston. I'm sure that played into it. But as we continue this conversation, you'll see that they were also on the same page about a lot of things. So turning our attention to the interior of the building, you can see the rose window in the context of Ralph Adams Cram's Gothic style nave or main aisle of the cathedral. And knowing a little bit about how Connick felt about his work, Cram felt very strongly about Gothic style architecture. And the main elements of this style were height, so that vertical feeling of the space, and light, the windows. And as such, the stained glass is not just a feature, it is kind of in many ways the feature. The other thing I'll say about Charles Connick, the designer of the rose window, is that his style of stained glass was much more in keeping with what you would have seen in the Middle Ages. He wasn't really interested in what some of his contemporaries were doing, trying to bring stained glass into a more modern medium. So people like Tiffany were really changing the way stained glass was seen. Connick wanted to focus on the way it used to be. Again, knowing that Cram was a big Gothic purist and an enthusiast for medieval styles of architecture, it's not super surprising that the two of them got along and worked together frequently. Thinking about the way the rose window relates to the rest of the architecture around it, it comes in fourth largest in the world at 40 feet across. The three windows that are larger are the west front window at Chartres Cathedral in France, and two of the windows at Notre Dame in Paris, France. Those are 46 and 43 feet respectively. Ours is 40. At 40 feet across, if you recall your high school geometry equations, you can figure out how big the window is around by multiplying that number by pi, or 3.14159, etc., etc., etc. That brings us to a circumference around the window of 125.5 feet and change. Interestingly, if you follow my little cursor here, the main arches that support the central aisle of the nave are 125.5 feet high. So the circumference of the rose window corresponds directly to the height of the space that it appears in. And that is definitely not an accident. That was something that Cram and Connick, I'm certain, worked together to figure out and make a feature of this incredible window. But to give you a sense of what 40 feet across actually means, when we focus in on the details of this window, that translates to the central figure, so this circle here, sitting in a space that is equivalent to human size. So if the human figure seated in that central circle were to sit next to you or me in a room, he would be approximately the equivalent of a 5'7" man. For those of you who know me personally, you know that's actually about my size when I'm wearing tall shoes. So if we zoom in on that figure, knowing that he's life size, it really starts to give us some perspective on the rest of the window and its real life size and scale. But let's focus on the details of this image and try and figure out who it is we're looking at. Now, if you're listening and you are thinking to yourself, it's the guy in the middle of a rose window in a Christian cathedral, I think I know who I'm looking at. That's fine and fair. Just bear with me here, because there really are some interesting details here when you start to look. We'll begin with the halo behind his head, which in this case appears to be almost striped red and white. What this is actually showing is a red cross within the white halo. And from the Middle Ages until today, in Christian art, you see a figure with a halo containing a cross. That is an indication that the figure you're looking at is a representation of Jesus. If you're not willing to take the halo's word for it, let's continue exploring because we'll find some more proof. If you check out his hands, which I'm circling with my cursor, and his feet here, you will see that each of them is marked with a black dot. And this is not a flaw in the stained glass. These are representative of the wounds that Jesus suffered when he was nailed to the cross during his crucifixion. So not only does this additionally reinforce the idea that the figure we're looking at is Jesus, it also tells us that this is Jesus after the crucifixion. So in all likelihood, we're looking at an image of Jesus post-resurrection, Jesus in his most divine state after having been resurrected from death. Finally, I'll draw your attention to these shapes below his hands in blue. On the left, the alpha of the Greek alphabet, on the right, the omega of the Greek alphabet. So these are the first and last letters of that alphabet. And this is a reference not only to Jesus, but to St. John the Divine, the namesake of the cathedral, and the book of Revelation, which is the book of the Bible that he authored. In that book, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." I might have those last two lines switched, so if I do, I'm sorry. But the point here is that Alpha and Omega are frequently used as ways to represent Jesus without showing his actual body in Christian art. And in this case, they're also tying the figure that we do see to the larger context of the cathedral and its namesake. And it's giving us a little bit of a preview of what we might see in the rest of the window. So if we go ahead and zoom back out, take our attention to the figures around this central figure, who again is life-sized. You'll see there are 16 spokes, almost like a wheel coming around the middle here. And if we zoom in on them, there's some really cool stuff happening there as well. So you can see here, as we zoom in, each of these spokes contains another figure, a golden robe with red wings and a white halo behind their head. These figures up here are all playing trumpets. Now, one of my absolute favorite features of this particular part of the window is that as you go around the circle, these figures change direction. So the figures in the bottom half all have their heads in towards the middle, and the figures in the top half all have their heads out to the outside. just because you don't want to have them totally upside down when everyone else is right side up. So if we zoom into these figures down here at the bottom, we see similar depiction, the same robes, the same wings, same halos, but these figures are not playing trumpets. They are holding something sort of long and dangly and golden. And if you frequently go to a church service, you might recognize this as one of the containers that holds the incense. So this is called a thurible. And the thurible is the thing that someone swings to spread incense as the procession walks through the service. So these angels, shown down here in the bottom half of this circle, are holding thuribles while their friends up in the top half are playing trumpets. So really, these angels are doing things that we might expect to see in a church service. Kind of an interesting feature. Now we'll turn our attention to the outer ring of the rose window and the figures that are contained out there. We'll start with the figures in the 4 compass points, so north, south, east, and west. And right off the bat, even before we zoom in, you might notice that these figures are shown in very similar attire to the figures we've already looked at. Jesus and the angels, both shown in red and gold. And these figures too, wearing sort of the gold robes with red and orange over it. And if you look closely at this figure here, you might notice that surrounding him is an indication of who he is. So insider tip in medieval style stained glass windows, oftentimes the figures are labeled. Not always, but often. So the label tells us that we are looking at Saint John. So here in the north point, directly above the head of Jesus in this window, is Saint John the Divine, author of the book of Revelation. Now, those of you who know your Bible well may already have an idea who the other 3 figures out here on the compass points are, but let's continue to zoom in and investigate anyway. So over here on the east side, we have Saint Mark. You can see his name also labeled around his body. And you might notice that both John and Mark so far have been shown holding a book and a quill. So let's continue. Again, those of you who are real familiar with the Bible may already know who we're going to be looking at in these last 2, but bear with me, humor me here. On the bottom, in the south point, we have St. Luke, again, holding the book and the quill. So I'm guessing some of you at least already know that over here on the west, we have St. Matthew. And interestingly, St. Matthew is opting to hold his quill and his book in the same hand. Very challenging. I'm not sure what his strategy is there. But in any case, holding the book, being shown as writers, is a pretty standard practice for these 4 figures who contribute the 4 main books, or the 4 books, not main, but just books, of the New Testament of the Bible. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the 4 compass points surrounding our central figures. But now let's dig into some of the figures around them. So we'll go to the secondary points now, northeast, southwest, etc. And we'll start up here. We zoom in. Now this figure is shown with a very different kind of robe and attire than the figures we've already looked at. This guy's wearing blue, and you can see he's got a really nice beard. His name is right across the center of his body. This is Jeremiah. And you'll see his halo has a little different look to it than some of what we've seen before, almost like a ring of fire around his head. So let's zoom back out and let's take in this guy down here at the bottom. You'll see also rocking a great beard, his name across his middle, Ezekiel, that same sort of flame-like halo. Now, those of you, again, if you know your Bible really well, you may be catching on to a pattern here. But we'll go check out this guy down here. Similar, his beard not quite so long, perhaps he's younger. His name there, Daniel. And finally, the 4th figure up here in the northwest corner, we see Isaiah, shown much more fresh-faced than our other friends. So what does this mean? Well, it means that in between the four gospel writers, the four contributors to the New Testament, we have Old Testament prophets. And so this is combining the books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament that came before Christianity, and the books of the Christian New Testament together surrounding the central figure of Jesus. So these are our main figures, but you might have noticed there's a lot more going on in this window. So let's zoom in to this top corner and let's check out some of the additional decoration. So we'll just scooch this up a little bit here. So once we get into this place, we can see that there's a lot of additional sort of detailing in between our main figures. I'm going to draw your attention to this figure here. This appears in what is known as a trefoil, or a three-petaled object. And then we'll check out this figure here in what is known as a quatrefoil, or four-petaled object. So starting with our trefoil, you'll see that colors are much more similar to the gospel writers, but what we're looking at is kind of just a floating head with a halo. These red objects surrounding it are actually wings. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wings surrounding this head. Now that gives us a little bit of an indication that we're looking at something maybe not human. These trefoil figures are meant to represent the seraphim, or the first in the order of angels in the Christian hierarchy. You'll notice that the seraphim, as I pointed out before, are associated with the four gospel writers. Now if we go over here to this quatrefoil, we have the same kind of floating head, but the wings around it in blue. These are meant to represent the cherubim, which are the second in the order of angels. They are depicted in the colors and flanking the Old Testament prophets. Additionally, the seraphim are symbols of divine love, the cherubim of divine wisdom. So you have the first in the order of angels, figures of divine love surrounding our four New Testament prophets, and the second in the order of angels representing divine wisdom surrounding the figures of the Old Testament prophets. So really, a lot happening in this window, but ultimately, if we go from the center and work our way out, we have Jesus and the angels, the writers of the books of both the New and Old Testaments, symbols of divine wisdom and love, corresponding to those different books. This is basically a depiction through humans and divine figures of the Bible itself, appearing in the front wall, 40 feet across, human-sized depictions of these various values and stories. So that's a little bit about the rose window and its iconography. I will also mention that as we've been looking at all these details, you might have noticed that there is an awful lot of individual pieces of glass. So within the 40 feet of this great rose window, there are over 10,000 individual pieces of glass contributing to the images that we just explored. And by no means have I gone through an exhaustive list of every detail. So I will leave you just with one last look at this image that was taken, hard though it may be to believe, only a month ago on Ash Wednesday, February 27th of this year, of the rose window looking down on a service taking place in the cathedral. And you can see again that context of the architecture, of the people in the building, of artwork. This contemporary piece that we actually have hanging in the building right now is called The Miraculous Draft by Ukrainian artist Alyosha. And all of this with the rose window in its background. And so it really gives you a sense of the size, of the scale, of the relationship between the building, its windows, and what happens within the space. So I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the rose window at the cathedral. I also hope that this makes you interested to come visit us when that's something we can do again. Learn more about the rose window and some of our other stained glass. If you have questions about any of the stuff that I talked about or things that maybe you noticed that I didn't mention, please leave comments. We will do our best to get back to you and get you answers. And I appreciate you spending some time with me today. Please be safe, wash your hands, and we hope to see you at the cathedral when all of this is over.